past 2 days of this conference. And we have really great program tonight. I just want to make one quick announcement before we get started that the newest issue of the Burning Spear newspaper, which is the official newspaper of the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement, is hot off the presses. This is the longest running African revolutionary newspaper in existence. It's been in publication since 1968. The most recent issue, summing up the world situation from the point of view of the African working class, is available right now, so you can check it out at our table over here after the program. So I want to bring up our first speaker, the chairwoman of the African People's Solidarity Committee and author of Overturning the Culture of Violence, Penny Hess. Uhuru.
Uhuru! Uhuru, everybody. Well, we've had an amazing conference and process this weekend. I know some people had to leave right now, but it's continuing, and it continues through tomorrow. And the thing that we have talked about is that this was a conference, a plenary conference of the African People's Solidarity Committee, the organization of white people that work under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party. Our job is to work in the white communities to build solidarity for the struggle for African liberation and the liberation of all African and oppressed peoples around the world. And we've talked about a lot about what is this relationship, what is the basis of it, what is our understanding of the relationship of white people, of Euro-American people to Africans, what is the history of it, what is a principled relationship, what can be forged and what has been forged by the African People's Socialist Party and the APSC. We've talked about the crisis of imperialism that we see all around us, a crisis of a system that's built on the enslavement of Africans, that's built on the genocide of the indigenous people, that's built on colonialism all around the world. This is what created capitalism. This is what created imperialism. This is what created the wealth of the United States and Europe. And that, the chairman always tells us, if we look back in history, Europe was poor, it was impoverished, it was disease-ridden in the Middle Ages, and it rescued itself through its assault on Africa and African people. I mean, you can look at that reality, you can see it. Once you begin to understand this reality, you can look at history, and you can see that the so-called Dark Ages, and we could call it the White Ages, were between the fall of the Roman Empire and the trade in African people in 1500. In between that time, Europe was desolate, except for the areas that were influenced by the Moors and Africans that lived in Spain. And there was 99% illiteracy in Europe, there was poverty, there was violence, and, and that this system was built on the backs of African and indigenous peoples all over the world. So we've talked about how the chairman says the crisis of imperialism has been brought about through the resistance of colonized peoples all around the world. What we have seen in North Africa, what we've seen in the Middle East, what we see throughout Africa, the kind of resistance that we've seen in the African and Mexican communities here as well, and around the world, that it's no longer easy or simple for imperialism to just go out and plunder the resources of other peoples around the world. They were pushed out of Iraq. They were defeated in Iraq just now. They didn't want to leave, as the chairman was pointing out, forced to leave, U.S. forced to leave at 2:30 in the morning out of Iraq just a couple of weeks ago. And that, we see the struggle of peoples around the world to control their resources without the intervention of the most violent and vicious system that has ever existed on the face of the earth. We have discussed this weekend the question of racism versus colonialism. That the struggle is not against racism. Racism is a real thing, but it is the ideological underpinnings of a system built on the enslavement of African people. It is the ideological justification of the assault on Africa and African people, but the relationship that has to be rectified is the colonial domination of African people by the U.S. government, by France, by England, all around the world. And so that the primary struggle for us as white people is not to unlearn racism, is not to spend time keeping ourselves in the center of this question, but to build a movement in solidarity with the struggle of African people for national liberation, to regain Africa. And that the struggle that we've talked about here is a struggle of African people as one people, whether they're in France, whether they're in anywhere in Africa, whether they're in the Bahamas or Jamaica or Guadeloupe or Guyana or Brazil or any other place, that Africans have been deposited forcibly around the world through this system built on the enslavement of Africans. And we've had powerful discussion this weekend about this question, struggle about it, you know, understanding that, yeah, I mean, of course, there is this ideology everywhere of racism, but unlearning racism does not solve the political and economic oppression of African people. We can unlearn racism and go back to our nice, cozy houses, but Africans still live in the conditions of colonialism that they live in. So we've talked about that, and we've talked about the chairman's understanding of Marx's theory called primitive accumulation of capital, which is really powerful. When Marx, way back in Das Kapital, Part 8, way back, page 812, or something like that, when he talks about, well, how did capitalism get its startup money? And he said, well, it came from the enslavement of Africans, the genocide against the indigenous people, and the theft of their resources, and the colonization of oppressed peoples around the world. That was the startup money. And so this is a profound understanding. Capitalism was born this way. It was born parasitic. And that we have the understanding that all white people sit on the pedestal of African oppression. It's not like, you know, white working people are exempt from that, because white working people got their jobs based on Africans enslaved in Africa churning out the gold or harvesting the cotton so that white workers could, you know, create fabric in the cotton mills of Europe. You know, this is what created the jobs for white people. This is what created the livings for white people. And we've talked about how Europeans came over to this country impoverished in the 19th century, in the 20th century, as poor people, but knowing that if they came here and united with the oppression of Africans or indigenous people, they could walk up the ladder of success. And so that even communists came from Europe uniting with the whole movement here to keep African people enslaved. This is your history. This is your history. We can look at the history of white people, white poor people, who would lynch Africans, bringing terror down. There were at least 10,000 lynchings against African people in this country that are recorded, and we don't know how many were unrecorded, that went unrecorded. But why would white poor people do that when it was their bosses that were exploiting us? It was the bosses, the rulers, but yet we should have been lynching them. We were lynching Africans. This is our history. This is what we have to look at. That is the truth in this country. And so we say that white people sit on this pedestal of the oppression of African and oppressed people. And we talked about the question of opportunism, how every time white people lead a movement, it always gets sold out, because all we want is more money, more pay, more days off, and or gay rights at the expense of Africans, at the expense of everybody else. We're saying we want gay rights, to to be able to gentrify the African community, to move in and push the African community out. We're saying that we want our rights to be able to be policemen so that we can shoot down African people in the streets, or we want our rights to be in the military, to kill colonized people in Afghanistan. That's what we're saying, the question of opportunism, and we have discussed this and gone deeply into it. We've talked about the resistance of the people on the planet Earth. This is what's weakening and bringing down U.S. imperialism and its power. This is what has created the economic crisis that exists right now, not something that Citibank did or Bank of America or Goldman Sachs. It's because the resources are being fought for, that the resources that belong to oppressed people around the world. And we talked about the Occupy movement and the fact that suddenly here are white people who are angry because Wall Street is no longer giving them an easy student loan, or their student loans are too high or cost too much, or they're not getting what they expected, the kind of I heard a woman interviewed, and she said, well, I'm here because I'm not going to be able to get the kind of job that I should be afforded. You know, she should be afforded at the expense of the majority of the people on the planet Earth. So how can we say that this is a progressive movement if it is calling on Wall Street to go back to exploiting everybody else more so they can give more loot back to us? You know, we have to say we unite with the struggle of the people in Egypt, of the people in Afghanistan, of African people here, of Mexicans here. This land was stolen from the Mexican people, of the indigenous people, of people struggling, the people of Venezuela and Cuba and all the people who are struggling to control their lives. And that there's no way that we can say that we're the 99% when, in fact, we, in reality, live at least in the top 20% of the world's population, no matter how poor we are in this country. And that we never wanted to be in the 99% when the people of Palestine were calling on our support. We never wanted to be in the 99% when the indigenous people were struggling for their land, and we picked up the gun as, quote, pioneers and shot them down. We never wanted to be part of the 99% when Africans were struggling to liberate themselves from this chattel slavery, this violence being imposed on them. We never wanted to be part of the 99% answering the call of the Vietnamese people or the call of the people of Chile or Nicaragua or the peoples around the world that said, you know, go out there and struggle against your own government and what it is doing to oppress people around the world. We didn't want to be the 99% then, you know, but now we're the 99%. Now suddenly we're the 99%, and we're saying that, you know, not being part of the 99% has its responsibilities, and that we have to, you know, we can join the 99%, but it's not going to be like, okay, well, here we are now. You know, we're ready. Why? You know what they used to say after the Rodney King? Why can't we all be friends now? Why can't we all get along? What are you so angry about? You know, the usual questions. What are you so angry about? And that, yeah, we can be part of the 99%. But what we have to do is stand in solidarity with the struggle for the liberation of the 99%. We have to break our allegiance with a government that expects us to carry out its will, whether from the right or the left, and that we have to be able to go back into the white community, win other people just like ourselves, and unleash all the resources that have been stolen from African and oppressed peoples around the world. That's reparations. We have to turn it back over. We have to say that this is, you know, this is the struggle that we have to take on. We have to stand in solidarity with the forces struggling for national liberation. What's happening right now that is so powerful to see is that the African People's Socialist Party that leads this movement is growing all over the world. It's so exciting to go on YouTube or go into actually Uhuru News and see somebody saying one Africa, one nation, only they're speaking Lingala, or they're speaking French, they're speaking German. They're an African from someplace else in the world saying, I can only understand a few words in that language, but I can hear him saying, we're one people, we're one African people all around the world. We're struggling. We're struggling for our liberation, the liberation of Africa. African people are going to control that. And this is a new world. This is what brings the energy and you know, the optimism for the future. I mean, people say to us, well, you're so optimistic for the future. You're supposed to be depressed. Well, we're not depressed because we can see imperialism is going down and the people on the planet Earth are rising up. And that's what the struggle is about. And that's what we've been discussing this weekend. And it is so powerful to see. And to see that the chairman talked about how the African People's Socialist Party has had, he called it, the daunting task of one simple goal: unite all African people, 1 billion strong, around the world, under the leadership of the African working class, to liberate Africa and all its resources in the hands of African people and African working class. That's it. That's a simple task. It's as simple as that. And it's happening. It is happening. And we can see it. We can see it growing up, and we can see this movement growing. And our job from the Solidarity Committee is to win other North Americans, wake people up, shake them. You know, we don't have the luxury to just sit around and discuss an idea. We have to get to work to be part of this changing world, to take responsibility for it, that whatever happens, that I'm not going to pass this down, what we see in this world today, this violence, this viciousness, this war, this sick society that dominates the peoples on the planet Earth and destroys their culture and their ability to even live and propagate. I'm not going to pass this down to anybody else. And we have a responsibility to be inside the belly of the beast and take it on from inside. That's what we have to do. And the chairman talked about how he was saying a little bit earlier how that, you know, a lot of times African people join the movement and have pain, they experience the pain of colonialism and the everyday problems that are just incredible that African people have to face in everyday life. And that he was saying that North Americans or white people don't always, or don't join from pain. And I remember, we were talking about the old days of the Solidarity Committee when it first formed in about, this was in about 1978. And the woman that was the chair of the Solidarity Committee at that time, the same woman that the chairman talked about that was nominated to be the chair because she had a good relationship with her lover, etc., said, I remember her saying, we were in a meeting in Atlanta, and she said, well, African people don't experience pain as deeply as white people do. And the chairman, I'll never forget it. Like, he went down on his knees. He was sitting down. He just like went down on his knees and he went, "We don't experience pain." You know, it was really so. There's no way that I would, you know, ever make a comparison of anything that a white person goes through that's anything like the pain that African people experience, and I understand that. But I would say that there is a kind of pain that white people do experience, and and I think that is a reason, one of the reasons why people are looking for things, and sometimes they find, you know, Islam and convert to Islam instead of Christianity, or they, you know, they find some yoga thing or, you know, retreat or some other kind of thing because of this pain. And the pain is the horrible pain of self-imposed isolation from the majority of the people on the planet Earth, a separation from the majority of humanity. And I think that I think that pain is deepening as this crisis deepens. And I think that a lot of North Americans and Europeans can, see something about the deep humanity of African people and people on the planet Earth. There's something like, I forgot the number, but there's like millions of North Americans who live outside of the U.S., who live in Africa, live in Asia, live in the Caribbean, Mexico, South America. They've left it, instead of staying and struggling, they've left it. And usually, if you hear people like that interviewed, they're saying, well, I found the humanity of the place I live now is so deep, it's so beautiful, I love it, I could never go back to America, and I think that there is that search, there is that search. It's, I saw this video, people might have seen it, but I just thought it was interesting. It was a video that went viral of this teenage white boy, and he had a heart condition, and he knew he was probably going to die, soon. And he said he actually made this video on Christmas Day, and he had his first heart attack when he was 4 years old, and he was 17 now. And he said, so he made this video, and he told about his story, but he didn't tell it by telling it. He held up little signs and told the story. I don't know why, but that night he actually died. That night he died. So this was just a few hours before he died. And he said what he was telling, and he's holding up these signs and telling the story, and he was saying, well, I almost died. I had a near-death experience 2 weeks ago in school, in high school, and I almost died. And you know how people talk about when they come back from their near-death experience, and they have, and he said, and I'm not afraid to die now. I'm totally not afraid to die, because I had this vision, or whatever you want to call it, in that near-death experience. And he said, I saw something, and what he saw, it wasn't Jesus, it wasn't God, it wasn't, an angel or the Holy Mary or something like that. Who he saw was an African rapper. I can't remember his name. Okay, who he really liked. I really like him. And he goes, I saw him, and we're like going into heaven, and I saw him, and he told me, and he says, well, he said, and I looked really good, and so did he, like they were all dressed up in a certain way. And he goes, and he told me, it's going to be all right. And so he said, I came back, I was resuscitated, but I'll never be afraid to die now. And I just thought that was interesting, because it's like what you were talking about, how, and what was interesting about it too was the fact that his parents, after he died, I had read this story that his parents said, well, he had this deep concern for the children of Africa, that he had heard about that children were forced to be child soldiers, and he had this deep, it just bothered him really, really deeply. And so his parents, of course, gave money to some Christian charity that was, going into Africa. I know, but the point is that it's just interesting, because this guy was just a typical, out in Texas or something, and it just, I think that in the psyche of white people is this thing about this relationship to white people to Africans, and the humanity of African people, which is so deep and so, and what our job is to, go in, because we come to this movement with our baggage, and that baggage is not pretty, it's ugly, it's intense, and that what we have the job to do is go back into white society and just organize, dorky, unhip, uncool, arrogant, self-absorbed, self-interested white people, just like ourselves, to come on, join the world. Don't try to protect the system that's going down. The people are going to bring it down, that keeps you as the enemy of the majority of humanity? Come on, jump in. Jump in. You know, take responsibility for what our history has been. And, you know, find our own humanity in that process. And as much as I sympathize with all the white people who want to leave America and Europe and go somewhere great like Africa or, you know, indigenous somewhere, we can't do that. You know, we have a job to do. We have a job to do that all of humanity is waiting for us to take on. And think about what that means for the people of Afghanistan. If we were struggling here, not to get more money back from Wall Street, but to bring U.S. imperialism down. Think of what that would mean for the people of Palestine. Think of that what that would mean for the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 million, I don't know how many Africans locked up in the gulag of America called the prisons. You know, what would that mean for the entire world if the white population could take a principled stand, could stand up, could say, you know what, this government will never apologize for the enslavement of Africans, but we're going to take it on. We're regular citizens, we're going to take that on. We're going to say, yeah, these resources got to go back. Africans got to be paid, you know, and that this system built at the expense of everybody else's, it's no life to live. I'd rather struggle like this. I don't want to take some kind of drug to make me, you know, get my sanity back or, you know, have to be able to face the world with a false smile. I want to take it on. I want to live. I want to be with other people in an honest relationship, not, oh, gee, I really like your music. Can I produce it and make money off of it? Or, oh, I really like your clothes. Could I, you know, sell those in America now? And I mean, no, you know, we have to have an honest relationship and take this on inside the belly of the beast. It's got to go. And it's like all the rest of the world has to tiptoe around white people. You know, oh, we might get our feelings hurt. Yeah, well, okay, let's open up our feelings and get it out there because we've got to take it on. We have to stand up and grow up and be human beings and be worthy of standing shoulder to shoulder with majority of the people on the planet Earth who have never had the luxury of having their children get to go to college. Their children are being bombed and napalmed and starved to death through sanctions and everything else that gives us the resources to keep living, you know? And so we have a responsibility, and it has to be organized. We have to be in an organization. It's like the chairman said, we're not going to do anything as an individual, but maybe make ourselves, you know, delude ourselves that we're cool. We have to be organized. We have to be organized under the leadership of the African Revolution. And we have to be that in the white community. We have to take black power into the white community and take that on. And that's what the African People's Solidarity Committee is about. Uhuru.
Uhuru. That was awesome. Thank you, Penny. Appreciate that presentation, and I'm very proud to be one of the dorky white people in the African People's Solidarity Committee, chaired by Carolyn Penny. All right, with our, oh, and again, just want to remind you, you can pick up Carolyn Penny Hess's book, Overturning the Culture of Violence, from our table right over here. Our next speaker is the president of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement and former mayoral candidate of Philadelphia. Please welcome Diop Olugbala.
Where's Chimarenge? You absolutely right. Did y'all see that video? Uhuru comrades, but seriously, yeah. This has been definitely a tremendous plenary process. It makes me really look with great anticipation for the party's plenary coming up February 18th through the 21st because it's been a lot of political education, deepening of African internationalist analysis of what's going on in the world, and really just giving us clarity on how to move forward. I was asked to speak on the recent struggle that the party engaged in Philadelphia via imperialism and the campaign to elect Wali Diab Rahman, myself, for mayor of Philadelphia. And I think it's important to firstly say that the campaign for mayor was essentially, objectively, a struggle to intervene not only in the electoral process, but more importantly to raise up NPD's Revolutionary National Democratic Program into the political discussion that otherwise would be dominated by the white ruling class in the city of Philly and even beyond Philadelphia. And we were very effective in that task. You know, part of the evidence being the fact that we walked away from the election with more than 6,000 votes, and many more people who actually voted were in support and unity with our program. So the campaign put NPDOM and our politics right in the center of the main form of political discussion in the city. So it was a tremendous victory for that reason alone, but there were other gains that we won. But one thing that I think is important to say, especially in the context of what we're doing here when we're talking about building revolutionary organization, is to understand that we know that as African internationalists, although our freedom can be taken away from us, it's never going to be given to us. And we know that we're never going to win our freedom. African people or any oppressed people will never win our freedom as a consequence of an election that was created and is controlled by the same forces that hold us in bondage. We're very clear on that fact. We know that the electoral process itself, as the chairman said earlier, is nothing but a nonviolent contest to determine which sector of imperialism will have control, or of the ruling class will have control over the state. But whether it be the Democratic Party, Republican Party, the ruling class of the finance sector of capital, or the oil industry, or whatever sector of the ruling class may happen to win the election, we know that imperialism and capitalism itself will always be upheld through the status quo, a part of which includes the electoral process. So we're very clear on that, but that doesn't mean that we don't intervene in the electoral process as a means, again, of raising up our program and helping Africans understand how to really distinguish our interests from the interests of white power and neo-colonialism. And that's probably one of the most important things that we was able to accomplish in the campaign to elect Wali Diab Rahman. When we came into that election, we had a situation in Philly where, first of all, like most majority African cities, Philadelphia, dominated by the Democratic Party, which has used, neo-colonialism as its main instrument to maintain control over the government and the state in that city, and a city where we've seen a string of neo-colonial mayors who have only been able to win the support of the masses simply because they're black. That's the only reason why the people went behind Wilson Good. That was, in the face of clear attacks that he waged against the African community. The only reason why the Democratic Party behind Wilson Good was able to put forth John Street and Michael Nutter was because they went uncontested ideologically and politically in the electoral process. And we stood up against white power in that contest in the election. And we strongly believe that as a result of the struggle that we waged for the campaign, that the electoral process in Philly and perhaps in other cities will never be the same again. No longer. And we saw it very clearly as we were doing the outreach, putting out the campaign. We heard our line coming back to us in terms of people were saying, yeah, it's not enough to be black no more. You got to have something to offer the African community. And essentially this was the RNDP, in motion, where the people started to make a distinction between just, a race politic and understanding that there's also a class struggle going on in the city of Philadelphia and in this country and in this world. So that was another important aspect of the program. We also were able to expose imperialism's inability and unwillingness to speak to the real interests of the African community at all. Similar in the 1960s, how our movements like JOMO, which created a blood bank for the African community through which Africans could get blood to provide our people who would have to undergo surgery and other operations, or how the Black Panther Party out in Oakland carried out sickle cell anemia tests and other so-called survival programs for the people. The revolution in the 1960s exposed imperialism's inability and unwillingness to speak to even the simplest of the material interests that the masses of African people face. And that's something that we was able to expose once again 30, 40 years later through the campaign, where we exposed how the resources, that all of which come from the black community, from slavery all the way up until the prison system and court fines and everything that revolves around it, we exposed how the city and the ruling class literally has, a scheme in place where they spend, first of all, over $1 billion, or a quarter of the people's money, on police and prisons. Secondly, you have this idea that the bourgeoisie continue to put out about an economic crisis, claiming that the city was running out of money, which never made no sense to us, given the fact that they spending so much damn money on the police, But more than that, we're saying, if the city is running out of money, we have a real program that can provide economic development as a means to offset the city's budget crisis, as well as put forth economic development for the productive forces in the city, as opposed to sending everybody off to prison. We're saying, even with, 1/5 of the $1 billion budget that you're spending, and 1/5 at that time, actually 1/3, nearly $300 million was allocated to, $2 million. That's less than a fifth. But the point is that we said you can take this small amount of the police budget alone and use that to implement an urban agricultural program that, would look something like what Comrade Camilla was describing APDEP doing throughout this country, converting the city's more than 40,000 empty lots into community gardens that could provide food for surrounding and starving communities, provide employment and skills and training for the same students who they claim are incorrigible and educable, and that's just with a small fraction of the city's $1 billion war budget being spent on police and prisons. And we exposed how at no juncture in this whole budget crisis the ruling elite, and we don't just say Nutter because we know that he is nothing more than a spokesman and a representative of a certain sector of the ruling class, but the ruling class never put forth any type of proposal that would call on the richest people in the city to contribute to solving the city's budget crisis. It's a literal fact that while Nutter was putting forth proposals like increasing sales tax by 1%, by implementing taxes for so-called sugary drinks and all other types of real estate taxes to get your garbage picked up, all types of crazy taxes are being slapped on the people left and right. But meanwhile, you literally have corporations like Comcast, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Phillies. They owe the city money in back taxes. And we know, let you try to walk out the store without paying your 1% increased sales tax, and you see what happens. But we see how the ruling class, uses the state as a means to protect its own economic and political interests, and uses the state to attack and further exploit the African community. And we expose that in a very easy to understand, digestible political line, a platform that we was able to put out widespread precisely because we intervened in the electoral process through the campaign for mayor. We exposed in our demand for community-controlled education, saying that the way that this education system is being run right now doesn't make any sense, especially if the city's main problems include a budget crisis, include a failing education system. We have to, take a real close look at the fact that, one, the ruling or the governing body of the school system is comprised of people who don't even live in the city of Philadelphia. It's the organization called the School Reform Commission that is comprised, 3/5 of which is made of people who don't even live in Philadelphia. And more than that, the School Reform Commission receives millions of dollars from unknown sources, right? And some of those dollars go directly to pay off a superintendent that's putting forth an education program that got nothing to do with educating the masses of youth, primarily African, Latino, and oppressed youth in the city of Philadelphia. You have a school system that literally has abandoned any agenda that speaks to providing basic, just basic skills and training and equipping the students with the ability to be competitive in the labor market. And this is in the face of a recent report that just came out in the Daily News where they said that the average black man between the ages of 30 and 50 who is unemployed today will never work again in his life. And the solution to that problem is to build more prisons, cut the school system, and what is left of the school system, the program being put forth by Nutter and his cronies in the School Reform Commission, is to cut any form of vocational training, any form of education that would teach the youth of the school system something about their own history, ethnic studies. Black history was wiped away under Nutter's administration. And meanwhile, more and more money is being invested in the so-called, standardized testing training. Literally, I think it was a boost of 20% funding for to train students how to take a standardized test, which has nothing to do with, equipping our youth with the future, to deal with the future. It may, give these charter schools and these privately owned, institutions an ability to get better grants because they determine who gets more money based on how well the students do in standardized tests. But meanwhile, the interests of the students and the communities that they come from are completely abandoned. So we expose that. We say the real solution is community control of education, a board of education that is controlled by the community, not in a broad, general kind of way, but specifically saying that, kind of like with Measure O, where, each section of the city, has its own economic and social interests, and therefore the school system should be responsive and have a real relationship with each section of the city. So North Philly, West Philly, Southwest, areas primarily oppressed and exploited African communities need to have a school, a community-controlled school board that has a completely different type of program than, what you would call like North St. Petersburg, North Side, in white areas. So that's just an objective fact, and we were able to win that program from the masses of the people, whether they voted for us or not. In fact, there were some, ruling class media, reporters that would actually hold up elements of our program, asking other candidates, the woman Karen Brown, who, the Republican, as we like to call her, the reporter asked her what she thinks about our program calling for an urban agricultural program. So that shows you how, in all of this, this is the politic of African internationalism. It's just that it's being intervened in the electoral process, but we're talking about a revolutionary national democratic program that we infuse into the electoral process and use as the way to expose what public policy would look like if it truly served the needs of the African community. So, this whole struggle, and again, this resulted in more than 6,400 people voting for Wali Diop Rahman on the ballot. Y'all know about all the struggles that we went through. I talked earlier about the Democratic Party, which is literally a machine. It's a well-organized, entrenched machine, political machine that has agents throughout the African community. We know the Democratic Party wouldn't have any strength if it was not for the African community, and it uses agents and functionaries, especially come election time, as a means to, you know, buy votes. Nutter had over $18 million in his campaign treasury, and he used every penny of that money, most likely, come election time, and that's how he ended up with, you know, over 100,000 votes. Not to mention the relationships he has with labor unions, and that's a whole other thing we can talk about, but we're running out of time. But the point is that the Democratic Party was organized, but only in relationship to our own campaign. And one of the most important things that we summed up is that the only way that they could have won the election is if we were not organized, and me as leadership of the work down in Philly have to be self-critical that we did not have the organizational capacity to really go out into the communities and win the people to vote for Wali Diab Rahman come election time. We've learned from that lesson, not just as a means of winning an election, but if we can make that type of impact in the electoral process, that we know that we can build the International People's Democratic Uhuru movement. As we speak, we are working the contacts. Everywhere I go, people recognize me, they know of the campaign, and, you know, now it's a matter of digging in, making the contacts, and bringing them into contact with the Uhuru movement, and that's what we are in the process of doing right now. So I know there's probably going to be discussion during Q&A, and you know, it's a highly educational process for all of our organizers who had some type of relationship with us in that struggle, and you know, I know we're going to do it. If we do it again, we're going to do it much better next time around, and we're definitely going to be more organized, whether we run for mayor or any other position or not. We got to build revolutionary organization to overturn this system that is responsible for the conditions that Nutter imposed, and the Democratic Party and imperialism as a whole imposed on our community. So, with that said, we'll say it one more time: Diop for mayor, and Uhuru means freedom. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Thank you, President Diop, future mayor of Philadelphia. Appreciate that presentation, Uhuru. All right, next, I want to bring up the International People's Democratic Uhuru movement is the mass organization of the African People's Socialist Party. And as Diop mentioned, the African People's Socialist Party will be celebrating its